Good morning. We're going to continue this morning as the sun comes up. It's beautiful. If you look at what looks like perfectly still water, there is a lot of fish today. Oh, I see the cormorants. Here comes the two geese that run off everybody. Looks like I got here just in time. Thank you for being with me. Living consciously. Oh, we're going to continue with those stories, it looks like. From last reading was Eva's story. So now this is just going to continue on with living consciously versus living unconsciously. So living consciously. In the midst of a heated argument with his wife, Jerry stopped suddenly and said, "Wait a minute. I think I'm being defensive and not really hearing you. Could we back up a few steps and try again? Now, let me see if I understand what you are saying." Living unconsciously. For years, Philip's wife had tried to tell him she was unhappy in their marriage. His typical response was to become uncontrollably sleepy. When she attempted to have a discussion with him early in the day, in the hope that he would be more awake, he snapped. "Why do you always start these impossible subjects when you know I'm getting ready to go to work?" When his wife asked for an alternative time that would be more suitable, he responded, "Now you're trying to trap me. I can't stand pressure." When his wife told him that unless they learned to communicate, she was unprepared to spend her life with him, he yelled, "Do you think other wives are any happier?" and stormed out of the house. When, after years of such non-confrontations, he came home one day to find her gone, and a note saying that she couldn't take it anymore, he cried to an empty house. "What's the matter? How could this have happened? How could she just leave without giving me a chance?" Do you identify with one of these patterns of behavior more than the other? Can you find aspects of yourself in these two stories? And do you like or dislike what you see? All right, and the next one, living consciously. Whenever Kay decided on a new goal, she immediately asked herself what would be required to attain it. When she wanted to start her own business, she prepared an elaborate plan of action, including a series of detailed sub-strategies that allowed her to move step by step toward her desired end. And then she proceeded to act. She did not wait passively for someone to provide her with the fulfillment of her dreams. When something went wrong, her typical response was, "What did I overlook?" When she encountered obstacles, she thought, not in terms of blame, but in terms of solutions. She took responsibility for being the cause of the effects she wanted. When she succeeded, she was not astonished. Now, living unconsciously, Mary was unhappy, working in a dress shop, and dreamed of having a shop of her own. But when friends asked her why and how she thought she could make a go of it, she answered, "But wouldn't it be wonderful?" When her boss reproached her for daydreaming on the job and being careless and inattentive with customers, she told herself, "It's hard to concentrate on unimportant things when I'm thinking about my own ambitions." When a friend suggested that it would be helpful if she showed more initiative at her job, she answered, "Why should I kill myself working for somebody else?" go the cormorants. I don't know if you can see them or not. I'll admit they didn't fly like cormorants, and they're making that whiny sound that I don't recognize. Okay, let's see, where was I at? Okay, living unconsciously. Mary was unhappy working in a dress shop and oh, I did get to that one. On hearing from her employer that her services were no longer required, she felt shocked and betrayed. She wondered why some people seemed to realize their dreams while she could not, and she thought, maybe I'm just not unscrupulous enough to succeed in business. She was vaguely aware of the hatred growing in her heart, but she called it indignation at the injustice of the system. If you knew two such women, which would you have more in common with? Which more reminds you of yourself? And can you see the implications for your self-confidence and self-respect? And the next one, living consciously. Elizabeth loved her husband, who was a builder, and when she learned that he was cutting corners on some of his construction projects in order to keep costs down in ways that bordered on the unethical, she was distraught. She knew that times were bad in the building industry and that the competition was ferocious, but her preoccupation with her own work prevented her from realizing how worried her husband was about his business. When Elizabeth broached the subject with him, at first he was angry and defensive. But when she persevered and he saw that she was concerned rather than hostile, he proceeded more and more to share with her his anxieties and the considerations that were prompting his corner cutting. Even so, they went through many difficult hours in the next week. At times, each lost control and resorted to shouting. But in the end, reason, love, and mutual respect won out. He committed himself to correcting his recent breaches on the job and to practicing the integrity he had exhibited in the past. His wife reinforced his confidence that he would find a way to prevail. Having successfully weathered another storm, their marriage became stronger. If you really love someone, Elizabeth said, you don't let fear stop you from challenging him when that's what the situation calls for. Now the next story, living unconsciously. Louise did not feel comfortable about her husband's new prospective partner when Paul brought him home for dinner. Paul owned several automobile service garages that were currently short of necessary capital, which this man was proposing to provide in exchange for a share of the business. None of the conversation at the dinner table made sense to Louise, and she did not attempt to bring it into clear focus. She told herself that business is a man's work, and she should not attempt to think about it. Nonetheless, it seemed to her, if only dimly, that the man was saying that while on paper he would now be the majority owner, In fact, the business would remain Paul's. After all, the man said, what do I know about service garages? She noticed that Paul seemed restless, distracted, and vaguely irritable whenever she spoke. She told herself that a wife's foremost duty is to keep the home peaceful, so she remained dutifully silent. She tuned out the rest of the conversation. She said nothing when she saw Paul sign the agreement papers without checking with his lawyer, and she chose not to think about it either, just as she chose not to think when she saw one employee after another being discharged on the orders of the new partner, and less experienced ones being hired without Paul's being consulted. Just as she chose not to think or to speak about it when she saw Paul's income shrinking for no reasons he could explain to her. Just as she chose not to think or to speak about it when Paul came home one day and announced that he was filing for personal bankruptcy. It was as if each blow were a signal to close down her consciousness still further. By now she was crying a good deal. In fact, they both were, but they were not speaking or thinking about it. What's there to think about? Paul said one day in answer to her silence. I had some bad luck. It could happen to anybody. Louise looked at him across that breakfast table, desperately keeping her mind wrapped in fog so that she would not start screaming. But she felt betrayed, not so much by her husband as by her parents, who long ago had promised her that if a woman is compliant and supportive and never challenges her husband, she will be happy. But Louise was not happy. Why had life cheated her? She wondered bitterly. Perhaps Paul will do something, she told herself. It was not in her or Paul's view of existence that husbands and wives might think and talk together about the issues of their lives. Can you find aspects of yourself in either of these women? If so, identify what they are. Are you proud or sad about what you identify? There's the sun. All right, on to the next one. Living consciously. When Norman reached the age of 42, he knew he had achieved the major goals he had set for himself. He was happily married, he was a physician with a successful practice, and he had 3 children he loved and was proud of. But he was becoming increasingly aware of a vague dissatisfaction rising from deep within, as if some unknown part of his self was trying to get a signal through to his conscious mind. At first, all he could identify was a diffuse sense of longing. He did not brush it aside. He watched it. Gradually, he found himself remembering a long-forgotten dream of his youth to write books. He reduced his work schedule and his social life to permit more time to explore these dreams and yearnings. He could not tell at first whether they represented a real desire or the residue of an adolescent fantasy, but he knew it was important to find out, because he knew that his life and what he made of it were important. He began to see that he passionately wanted to write fiction. Soon, he was working on the outline of a novel. 2 years later, the novel was finished. A year and a half after that, it was published. It did only moderately well, but by now Norman knew beyond doubt that this was the work he wanted. His second novel was more successful. His third more successful still. He retired from medicine to write full-time. Watching him, his wife saw Norman grow younger and happier. Watching him, his children learned an invaluable lesson. Honor your own wants. Honor your own life. Always be alert to your inner signals, he said to them. Don't act impulsively, but pay attention. Sometimes one part of our mind is years ahead of another part in its wisdom. Living unconsciously. Tim was bored. A psychologist who had opened his practice at the age of 28. He was now 51, and he wondered how he could stand another 20 or so years of the same work. He had an individual and a group practice, and occasionally he conducted seminars for industry. He could no longer remember the point at which he had ceased working for pleasure and began working solely for money. But he knew that pleasure had ceased to be relevant long ago. Once he had offered his client excitement. Now he offered tired, cynical wisdom. He felt like a fraud and was continually astonished that no one else seemed to notice. It occurred to him, vaguely, that clients came to him with just such problems as he was now experiencing. But that did not motivate him to think about his situation or to discuss it with anyone. His favorite recreation and escape was tennis. And often when a client was talking to him and he felt bored, he dreamed of tennis. To his family, he seemed more and more lifeless, withdrawn and irritable. And finally, he became enamored of a female client 30 years his junior and disappeared with her to an ashram in Colorado, led by an Indian guru who taught free love and drug experimentation, together with absolute submission to the will of the guru. As a path of spiritual enlightenment, the guru told him that thinking had been the cause of all of Tim's troubles, and Tim liked to believe that this was true. Two different attitudes towards life, reason, and reality. Which is closer to your own? And what do you observe to be the consequences for your self-esteem? In considering the preceding examples, observe the kind of issues involved in living consciously versus living unconsciously. Thinking, even when thinking is difficult, versus non-thinking. Awareness, even when awareness is challenging, versus unawareness. Clarity, whether or not it comes easily, versus obscurity or vagueness. Respect for reality, whether pleasant or painful, versus avoidance of reality. Respect for truth versus rejection of truth. Independence versus dependence. Active orientation versus passive orientation. Willingness to take appropriate risks, even in the face of fear, versus unwillingness. Honesty with self versus dishonesty. Living in and being responsible to the present versus retreating into fantasy. Self-confrontation versus self-avoidance. Willingness to see and correct mistakes versus perseverance in error. Excuse me. Reason versus irrationalism. In the preceding stories, you will find all these themes present implicitly. One of the most important issues entailed in living consciously is intellectual independence. A person cannot think through the mind of another. We can learn from one another, but real knowledge implies understanding, not mere repetition or imitation. We can either exercise our own minds or pass on to others the responsibility of knowledge and evaluation and accept their verdicts more or less uncritically. Of course, we are sometimes influenced by others in ways we do not recognize. But this does not alter the fact that there is a distinction between the psychology of those who try who try to understand things for themselves and those who do not. What is crucial here is our intention, our goal. As a matter of general policy, do you aim to think for yourself? Is that your basic orientation? To speak of thinking independently is useful because the redundancy has value in terms of emphasis. Often what people call thinking is merely recycling the opinions of others, not true thinking at all. Thinking independently about our work, our relationships, the values that will guide our lives is part of what is meant by living consciously. Independence is a self-esteem virtue. In considering the preceding vignettes, you may wish to ask, don't these people who live consciously already have good self-esteem? And don't the people who live unconsciously lack good self-esteem? How then can living consciously be the foundation of good self-esteem? We encounter here what I call the principle of reciprocal causation. By this I mean that behaviors that generate good self-esteem are also expressions of good self-esteem. Behaviors that are expressions of good self-esteem are also generators of good self-esteem. Living consciously is both a cause and an effect of self-confidence and self-respect. The more I live consciously, the more I trust my mind and respect my worth. Excuse me. The more I trust my mind and respect my worth, the more natural it feels to live consciously. This same relationship exists among all behaviors that support self-esteem. All right, we got a page here left, and then we're done with chapter 3. So thank you for hanging with me, letting me read to you. This has been How to Raise Your Self-Esteem by Nathaniel Brandon. Okay, think about these stories. Can you isolate the areas in your life where you operate with the most consciousness? How about the areas where you operate with the least consciousness? Using the material in this chapter for guidance, prepare 2 such lists in a notebook. This is an excellent way to deepen your understanding of what the issue of living consciously means for you. Now, let us say you identify 3 areas in which you recognize that your average level of consciousness is far less than it should be. Meditate on what seems to be difficult and staying in high-level mental focus in these areas. Then for each of these areas, write, the hard thing about staying fully conscious here is ... And then, as rapidly as possible, without censoring yourself or thinking, write 6 to 10 endings. The hard thing about staying fully conscious here is... So you need to write 6 to 10 endings to that. Then do the same for the good thing about me. The good thing about not being fully conscious here is ... Then follow with, if I were to stay fully conscious here. You will probably make some illuminating discoveries in doing the exercise. you will already be living more consciously. Okay, it looks like that was 3 questions. The hard thing about staying fully conscious here is, make that list, and then do the same for the good thing about not being fully conscious here is, and the final one is, if I were to stay fully conscious here. Okay. Finally, give some thought to tomorrow and the next 7 days of your life. Consider the question of how you can apply these ideas to your daily concerns. If, for example, you choose to be more conscious at work, what might you do differently? If you choose to be more conscious in one or more of your relationships, what would change in your behavior? If you wish to grow in self-confidence and self-respect, begin now. Identify 3 new behaviors in the realms of work and relationships, respectively, that you can practice this week and commit yourself to experimenting with them. And then go on working in the next 7 days and the next to expand your consciousness further, one small step at a time. In the arena of raising self-esteem, we evolve not by dreaming of giant steps, by committing ourselves in action to little ones, moving step by relentless step to an ever-expanding field of vision. Not that extraordinary breakthroughs and transformations cannot occur. They can, but not to those who wait in empty passivity. We must act. We must begin from where we are. One small shift to higher consciousness opens the door to another and another. It does not matter at what point we start. It matters only that we take the responsibility of starting. All right, the next one will be chapter 4, Learning Self-Acceptance. Thank you for being with me. I appreciate you.